King Edward III wanted to conquer France, but he didn't want to pay for it. If you were a foot soldier in his army, your life was valued at exactly 2 pence a day. For that pocket change, you had to march through the freezing mud, face iron arrows, and watch your friends die of dysentery. 2 pence wouldn't even buy you a loaf of bread in London, yet thousands of men signed up. They weren't fighting for king or country, they were fighting for something far more basic and far more desperate. What could possibly make a man trade his life for less than the price of a chicken? Stay with us, because the math behind medieval warfare reveals something darker than courage. It reveals an economy built on human desperation, where the crown balanced its books with the bodies of the poor. The year is 1346. England has been at war with France for nearly a decade, though most men couldn't tell you why anymore. Something about Edward's claim to the French throne, claims that mattered only to nobles who'd never lift a pike. For the common man, the war meant one thing: opportunity. Not the opportunity for glory, not the chance to serve God or country, the opportunity to eat. Across England, villages are hollowed out. The harvests have been thin for years. Wool prices have collapsed. Landlords are squeezing their tenants harder than ever. A man who owns nothing but the clothes on his back and the calluses on his hands has few ways to survive. The army offers one of them. The king's recruiting sergeants move through towns like merchants peddling hope. They promise wages, they promise shares of plunder, they promise adventure. What they don't promise is the truth. And the truth begins with arithmetic.
Let's talk about 2 pence. In 1346, a penny was not a small coin. It was silver, actual silver, about 1.5 grams of it, and a penny could buy you a day's worth of coarse bread. Not good bread, not the white loaf a merchant might eat, but enough dark, gritty rye bread to keep a grown man alive. 2 pence then was survival, barely. An unskilled labourer in peacetime might earn 1.5 pennies per day. A skilled craftsman, a mason, a carpenter could earn 3. So the army's offer of 2 pence for a foot soldier wasn't insulting. It was, by the standards of rural England, competitive. A man could feed himself on that wage. If he was careful, he might even save a little, might send something home to his wife, might dream of returning with enough coin to buy a cow. But here's the thing about army wages that the recruiting sergeants didn't mention. Those 2 pence were theoretical. They were a promise written on parchment, and parchment doesn't fill bellies. The English crown in the 14th century was perpetually broke. Edward III inherited a treasury drained by his father's mismanagement. The 100 years of war that was just beginning would cost the crown roughly £5 million over its duration, a sum so vast it's almost meaningless. To put it in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the English crown in peacetime was about £30,000. The war would consume more than the crown could ever generate. So Edward and his advisors did what desperate kings always do. They borrowed. They borrowed from Italian banking families, the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, who would eventually go bankrupt because of Edward's debts. They borrowed from English merchants. They borrowed from anyone with coin. And when they couldn't borrow enough, they started manipulating the currency. They clipped coins, they debased the silver content. A penny in 1346 wasn't what a penny had been worth in 1300. Inflation was eroding purchasing power even as wages stayed the same. The soldier in the field didn't understand monetary policy. He understood one thing: his 2 pence didn't go as far as he'd been promised. The army, in turn, understood something else. Wages were the least of their problems. The real cost of war wasn't paying men, it was feeding them, equipping them, transporting them, paying the nobles who demanded their own share. The crown's ledgers from this period are filled with entries like this: for the carriage of the king's artillery from the Tower of London to the coast, £47, 10 shillings and 6 pence. For the wages of 50 crossbowmen from Gascony, £60. For the purchase of 3,000 quarters of wheat, £300. These were enormous sums. A quarter of wheat, about 8 bushels, could feed a small company for a week. The army in France numbered somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men, depending on the campaign. They consumed something like 20 tons of food per day. Bread alone required hundreds of acres worth of grain, and all of it had to be shipped across the English Channel. The Crown made a calculation: pay soldiers less, spend more on supply, keep the army fed, even if barely, keep the men marching, even if resentful. Because a hungry soldier is one thing, a starving soldier is another, and a starving soldier is a soldier who deserts. But the men who signed up didn't know any of this. They saw the 2 pence, they heard the promise of plunder, they imagined returning home with French silver and fine cloth. They believed, because they had to believe, that the king would take care of them. They were wrong.
Consider a man named William at Ode. We know about William because his name appears in a single document, a payroll record from the siege of Calais in 1346. William was a foot soldier, an archer from the village of Shear in Surrey. He enlisted in the king's army because his father had died of fever the previous winter, and William had no land, no trade, and no prospects. His 2 pence a day was the difference between staying alive in France and starving in England. William was not alone. The army raised for the Crécy campaign in 1346 numbered around 15,000 men. Most of them were archers, armed with the legendary English longbow. They were farmers, tanners, blacksmiths, ordinary men who'd been ordered to present themselves for service. The feudal system technically required every able-bodied man to serve his lord at no cost for 40 days, but by the 14th century that system had broken down. Instead, men were paid, not generously, just enough. The payroll for the Crécy campaign shows the economic hierarchy of the army quite clearly. At the very top, the earls and barons commanded wages of 6 shillings and 8 pence per day. That's 80 pence, 40 times what a foot soldier earned. Knights received 2 shillings per day, 24 pence. Mounted archers, men who could ride and shoot, received 6 pence, and the common foot soldier, the man who actually did the fighting and dying, received exactly 2 pence. The Crown spent roughly £3,000 per month on wages during the 1346 campaign. That's about 1,000 man-months of pay. But here's where the math gets dark. The Crown didn't actually have £3,000 per month. They had to borrow it. They had to promise payment later. They had to issue what were essentially IOUs to the troops. And those IOUs, well, William at Ode couldn't pay his lord's rent with an IOU, couldn't buy bread with a promise, couldn't feed his family with parchment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because wages were only one part of the economic picture. The other part, the part that would make William's 2 pence even more inadequate, was the cost of everything else. Let's talk about the price of a sword. In 1346, a decent sword cost about 6 pence, 3 days' wages for William. A helmet, a shilling, 6 days' wages. A full set of armour, the kind of padded jack and chainmail that might actually stop an arrow, upwards of 20 shillings. That's 6 months of William's pay. He couldn't afford armour, he couldn't afford a good sword, he couldn't afford anything beyond the pike or the bow that was issued to him, and even then the army expected him to provide his own equipment. The Crown's regulations required every archer to bring his own bow and 24 arrows, but the bow alone cost several days' wages. The arrows, each one fitted with an iron tip, cost another penny each. William's entire arsenal would have cost him more than a month's pay, and he was expected to buy it himself. Think about that for a moment. The Crown valued William's service at 2 pence per day, but before he could serve, he had to spend weeks, maybe months of that pay on equipment that the Crown didn't provide, equipment that the Crown didn't reimburse. The soldier was paying to fight. And the Crown knew it. Medieval military contracts, known as indentures, specified that the soldier's wages would be adjusted according to the custom. That vague phrase meant one thing: the Crown would pay what it could, when it could, and the soldiers would accept it. The terms were never favourable to the peasant with the pike. But William had no choice. He'd already left the village, already said goodbye to his family, already committed to the campaign. If he deserted, he'd be hunted down and hanged. So he marched forward, his belly empty, his pockets emptier, towards a French army that was similarly miserable. And then came the battle.
But what happened next is where the economy of medieval warfare reveals its truest cruelty, a cruelty so profound it changed the math of death itself.
The Battle of Crécy, August 26, 1346. 25,000 English soldiers face perhaps twice that many French. The English are outnumbered. They're exhausted. They've marched for weeks, stormed across Normandy, and burnt their way through French countryside. The French are fresh. They're heavily armored. They outnumber the English 2-1. By any reasonable calculation, the English should lose. They don't. The English longbowmen, William Atwood among them, unleash volleys of arrows that decimate the French cavalry. The French knights, weighed down by armor, struggle through mud and corpses. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by the French, are hopelessly outmatched by the English longbow. In the end, the French lose somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 men. The English lose maybe 200. It's one of the greatest military victories in English history. Edward III has proven himself a military genius. The Crown's investment in the army, the paltry wages, the borrowed coin, the carefully managed supply lines has paid off in the most dramatic way possible. But here's the dark math that follows Crécy. Those 4,000 to 10,000 dead French soldiers, each one represented a significant economic investment. Their armor alone cost years' worth of wages. Their horses cost fortunes. Their training represented years of expensive practice. The French nobility has not only lost a battle, they've lost billions of modern dollars worth of military equipment. The English, by contrast, have lost 200 archers, men like William, men who cost the Crown nothing to equip, men who can be replaced with a few weeks of recruiting, men whose deaths don't show up in the Crown's ledgers as losses. They're just gone. The Crown's accountants, and there were accountants, meticulous ones who recorded every penny spent, did not lament the death of the archers. They lamented the need to pay the archers who survived. The payroll for the remaining months of 1346 shows something striking. Wage payments drop significantly, not because the army has shrunk, it hasn't, but because the Crown simply stops paying on time. The existing records from this period reveal that soldiers were often paid months late. Sometimes they were paid in kind, with food, with captured goods, with promises. The Crown's check roll from 1347 shows a staggering number of unpaid soldiers, many of whom died in the winter months that followed the battle. Dysentery, typhoid, exposure, the war killed them slowly. The Crown let them die on the page, their names scratched out, their wages never dispersed. But here's where the math gets even darker. The 2 pence wage wasn't just a payment, it was a cap, a ceiling. By 1349, the Statute of Labourers would fix wages across England at pre-plague levels, making it illegal for workers to demand more money. The Crown and the nobility colluded to keep wages low, to suppress the economic power of the peasantry. And the army was the proving ground for that idea. If a soldier's life was worth only 2 pence, then what was a farmer's life worth, a labourer's life, a woman's life? The plague, the Black Death, arrived in England in 1348, right after the Crécy campaign. And in its wake, the entire economic structure of the medieval world shifted. Labourers became scarce, wages began to rise. Suddenly, a skilled worker could demand 3 pence, 4 pence, even 6 pence per day. The old assumptions about value, that a man's life was worth a fixed wage, began to crumble. But the Crown didn't want to crumble with them. The Statute of Labourers was the Crown's answer, a law that said workers couldn't demand more than the wages of 1346, the same wage that had bought William's life, the same wage that had bought the lives of thousands of archers. The Crown was trying to freeze time, to fix the price of human life at exactly 2 pence. It didn't work. The peasants' revolt of 1381 was the inevitable result. Men who'd marched for Edward III, who'd bled for the Crown, who'd died for 2 pence, their sons and grandsons demanded more. They demanded the value of their labour. They demanded the value of their lives. And when the Crown said no, they marched on London. We know some of the names of those men: Wat Tyler, John Ball. They'd heard the stories from Crécy.
They knew what the crown had paid, they knew what the crown had taken, and they refused to be treated like currency any longer.
So what happened to William Atwood? We don't know. He might have survived Crécy. He might have returned to Sheer, scarred and broken, with a few coins in his pocket and stories he couldn't tell. He might have died of dysentery in the muddy camp outside Calais, his body tossed into a mass grave, his name scratched off the payroll ledger. The records don't tell us. The records don't care. But we do know what 2 pence meant to a man like William. We can translate it, not in exact terms, currency conversion is always imprecise, but in purchasing power. A modern American minimum wage worker earns about $7 per hour, roughly $56 for an 8-hour day. 2 pence in 1346 could buy about half a day's worth of bread. That's the equivalent of perhaps $2 or $3 today. A foot soldier's wage was worth less than the price of a small coffee. But here's the real modern comparison. In 1346, a man's life, the daily valuation of his labor, his suffering, his existence, was calculated by the crown at less than what you might spend on a sandwich. And the crown was not cruel for its own sake. It was cruel because it had no choice. The military economy dictated the value of human life, and the men who suffered the most were the men who had the least. What changed? Not as much as you'd hope. The peasants' revolt failed. Wat Tyler was killed. The crown's authority was reasserted. But the idea that labor had value, that a man's life couldn't be commoditized at a fixed, pitiable wage, that idea never died. It simmered, it festered, and eventually it found its way into the hearts of generations who'd never know the name William Atwood, but would still fight for their own 2 pence. The medieval ledger recorded every coin, every transaction, every debt, but the one thing it never recorded was the true cost of a human life. We're left to calculate that cost ourselves, and the math is sobering. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark economics of the medieval world, make sure to subscribe to The Medieval Ledger, where we uncover the real money and class stories behind history's most brutal accounts.